Hey guys, how is it going everybody? Welcome to another video. Last time out we did a whole lot of speculation on the new elite specializations and people seem to enjoy that video. Talked a whole lot about those icons, but today I want to continue the discussion on kind of more the concept art that we got to take a look at over the past couple weeks. There was a new piece of concept art released just a couple days ago now, I believe. I'm not exactly sure when this video is going to go out, but there was a new one released that is perhaps for the Guardian or the Thief. I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I'm going to kind of tag those on at the end of this video. In this video, I want to focus on the new Necromancer Elite specialization and some of the information we've gotten about them. I originally made this video just to be speculation on purely the silhouette itself, but because it's taken me so long to get this video out, they've actually already released a teaser trailer with some new information about this Elite spec. We now know that the name of the spec is the Harbinger, and some of the mechanics are also shown in that video. So in this video, I will go over some of my original speculation on this Elite spec, mostly about the spec's theme and some of the lore that I talked about, along with some of my updated thoughts now that we have some new information about it. The devs talked about how all the elite specializations were inspired by the Canthan setting, so the goal of this video is really just to see if there's anything about the Harbinger in particular that can give us hints about some of the possible themes and plot points that we might be able to see in End of Dragons. So one of the first things you'll probably notice when looking at this elite spec art, besides the gun obviously, is the really prominent and stylish hat that this Asura seems to be wearing. One thing to keep in mind about the elite specializations in Guild Wars 2 is that they all, usually at least, get a piece of unique armor as part of a collection. That's how it's worked for every other expansion so far, so this hat seems like a pretty good candidate for the spec armor piece, with the elaborate gem and the feather, and the interesting looking beaded chin strap. In the trailer there were some similar looking hats, and if I'm not mistaken there's actually another large brimmed hat that sometimes appears on the gem store. So while this is kind of a cool look, it's not completely new, but there might be a little bit more to this than first meets the eye. During the discussion about this teaser on the forums and also Reddit, the observation was made by a few individuals that the hat the character is wearing in this concept art is actually very reminiscent of traditional Korean headwear worn by high-ranking officials or kind of noble members of society. In fact, this Reddit user in particular also explained that these hats were also famously worn by what seems to be the Korean analog of the Grim Reaper. Some of the images I found even reflect the beaded chin strap that we see in this concept art, so this obviously doesn't mean that this elite spec is necessarily 100% inspired by these characters. Besides, the concept of a Grim Reaper is pretty common as far as I can tell, but this similarity did pique my interest, and I think it's pretty reasonable to believe that ArenaNet was somewhat inspired by this folklore, at least for the visual inspiration for this spec. So from what I've gathered from Reddit and a little bit of extra reading, these figures were typically responsible for guiding souls to the afterlife, and like most Reapers, were absolutely dedicated to their task. Like death itself, they are inevitable, a certainty. It's also interesting that in folklore they also kind of function as omens, often appearing to a person right before their death, or even at locations where a lot of death or suffering has occurred. And like the Reddit user commented, it's often considered bad luck to dream of them. Additionally, I learned that while normally non-violent, they would also sometimes carry instruments or weapons to finish off the few people who tried to escape them. And their persistence and dedication to this task means that they are also sometimes, I think humorously, depicted as office workers. This all seems pretty consistent with what we know of Necromancers in Guild Wars 2. I mean, we even have a specialization called the Reaper already, so is there really anything that new here? Well, one point that might seem obvious, but one that I thought was particularly interesting in a Canthan context, was the idea that these characters were responsible for not only capturing, but also guiding the souls of the dead. For those unfamiliar, Cantha has always been a really fascinating area of the world because everything about it is absolutely ancient, and it really feels quite different from anything else. Cantha is a deeply spiritual land where the people seem to be much more in touch with the mists and other cosmic forces than the humans of, say, Kryta. In Cantha, the emperors typically became Wei-no-Su, or closer to the stars, allowing them to see the spirits of the dead and even sometimes enter the realms of the gods. In some of the original Guild Wars lore, it's even suggested that the Canthan humans and the Northern Tyrian humans have different origins altogether, keeping in mind that in the Guild Wars universe, humans are pretty much aliens brought to this world by the gods. The Korean Reapers that we've been talking about could be compared to any number of the spiritual characters or entities in the Canthan setting, but they remind me most of the Envoys. The Envoys were likewise shepherds of the souls of the dead, appearing before newly released souls to guide them into the mists. The envoys in Cantha were also wicked criminals in life and serve as envoys as penance for their crimes, being forced into servitude by the mysterious Oracle of the Mists. I think this elite specialization art could suggest that the Necromancer might play a part in the complicated network of spiritual entities in Cantha. Perhaps the Necromancer will become some sort of servant of the Oracle of the Mists, or maybe even one of the envoys themselves, responsible for the collecting of souls. Since we now know that the name of this elite specialization is the Harbinger, this also brings with it some interesting questions about how this may tie into the story of Cantha. Interestingly, the word Harbinger is generally defined as something that signals the approach of another. So what could this new elite specialization be a harbinger of? Could it be one of the envoys, or maybe even one of the human gods like Grenth, who has a lot of connections with death and, of course, the underworld? Or is this more of kind of a generic name that we're not really supposed to read into? I'm not completely sure. The developers also mentioned that they would be touching on the big cosmic questions of Tyria in this expansion, many of which will probably revolve around the Elder Dragons, but I also have a feeling that much of the expansion will begin to explore the inner workings of Canthan spirituality, the afterlife, and the mists, and I think it makes sense that the Necromancers would also reflect this. This is a topic that I would love to make a video on at some point in the future, because I think these are all really important plot points in the future of Guild Wars 2 after the story of the Elder Dragons. One thing to note is that this concept of a spirit walker or servant of the envoys would really kind of blur the lines between the necromancer and the ritualists of the first game. And if the ritualist profession is supposedly coming back as an elite spec in its own right, then this might make things a little bit awkward. But there is a whole nother piece of this puzzle to talk about, and it revolves around some of the new mechanics we've learned about during this short reveal of the Harbinger. We learned, as many predicted, that the Harbinger will be getting access to elixirs in this expansion. And Harbingers, according to the teaser at least, are skilled alchemists who have developed special elixirs that allow them to directly inflict themselves with something called Blight. While in this new Blight Shroud, they have hand-to-hand combat abilities, it seems, very martial arts looking, where they use their own pain to damage their enemies. And this focus on Blight is kind of interesting because there's lots of different references to Blight in Guild Wars 2, particularly in the Heart of Thorns expansion with the Blighting Trees and the Blighting Pods, which is how Mordremoth essentially created his Mordrum. And if you remember in the story, Taimi even talked about how when Zhaitan was killed by us, the other Elder Dragons were almost able to absorb his death magic, and so Mordremoth in particular was able to use corpses in these blighting pods to create his new Mordrum minions. There's also many more generic references to Blight as some sort of general poison or condition, so there may not be a direct connection here, but it seems to maintain the general theme of death and working with the undead. In Path of Fire, we saw how the Scourge Elite specialization was, in lore at least, some sort of adapted version of Palawa Joko's Lich magic. So what power could we draw from in Cantha? Well, Cantha, if you remember, has quite a history with plagues. In Guild Wars factions, the Ministry of Purity was the organization tasked with hunting down the afflicted minions of Shiro Tagachi, which were living creatures, animal, human, or plant, that came too close to the magic of Shiro Tagachi and were permanently transformed into these wild abominations. From what we're told in the main story, this affliction was not supposed to be a traditionally contagious disease, and so after the death of Shiro, it's kind of assumed that the affliction would have been destroyed and would no longer be a blight to the people of Cantha. However, there is an interesting segment of Winds of Change, the last major update to the original Guild Wars, that adds new missions in Cantha that supposedly take place 7 years after the events of the base campaign. In these new missions, you are tasked by the Ministry of Purity with tracking down the last remaining afflicted that have held out in Cantha. One of these missions has you track down a very interesting character called Jeju Shadow Whispered. Jeju is a member of the Amfa, who were one of the two major factions, or one of the gangs in Cantha, along with the Jade Brotherhood. Jeju, though, is in possession of a magical artifact that can, in fact, despite what we believed, spread the plague. He claims the secret to this chalice of corruption was given to him by a voice who blessed him with the knowledge of its creation. Now, it's been a long time since I've played the original game, and I don't believe I ever played these missions firsthand, but to my knowledge, we never get an explicit explanation or any information about what happens to the chalice itself. But I think many assumed at the end of this mission it was destroyed. So not only are the afflicted not completely wiped out at this point in the story, but there was even a way, at one point, for the affliction to be spread without Shiro himself. My main question here is, does this chalice of corruption have any connection to these new blight elixirs that the Harbinger uses? Could our characters be harnessing the power of the affliction? Are we harbingers of the plague? Also, who's this mysterious voice that whispered to Jeju? Could the entity behind these whispers and secret knowledge still be around in Tyria 250 years later? In the original game, Abaddon was often behind many of these whispers, being the god of water and secrets, but I'm sure he was supposed to be destroyed by this point in the story. We know Mordramoth was able to whisper to the Sylvari, but only because of their very unique connection to the Elder Dragons. Could it have been the Deep Sea Dragon? These are all really interesting points that I hope we get to learn a bit more about in End of Dragons, even if it's just as a side story. Before I do end this video, I did want to talk about the new concept art that we got, the third piece of concept art that we got for a new Elite specialization, presumably the third of the 3 playable Elite specs in the upcoming beta on, I believe, the 17th of August, or a little bit before then. But this one's really making waves in the community because it seems to be a Guardian Elite spec. This image seems to clearly depict, alongside some of the edited photos that have come out later on, kind of enhancing the details that we can see, a dual sword elite spec. And the very interesting thing, the plot twist with this image, is that it almost certainly is depicting a heavy armor class. And that's a big deal, obviously, because of course the thief wears medium armor. So this could be our first big plot twist of this icon elite spec reveal. I talked in the comments of my last video a little bit about how I hoped there would be a couple twists and turns along the way, but I really didn't expect it with this icon. I believe I even saw a poll saying 77% of the people that voted in this poll for each of the icons marked the crossed swords icon art as the thief. I think a lot of the community was pretty convinced about it, but it is almost certainly wearing, I believe, the Warlord's heavy armor set. Conveniently though, the way I assign the icons, all I really have to do, I think, based on what I've seen, is flip the icons, flip my predictions for the icons, because I gave Guardian the Oni-looking face mask, and the thief, of course, the crossed swords, which I thought at the time was an assassin, which now seems like it's probably off the cards. But to me, all of a sudden the face mask makes a lot of sense for the thief, and maybe an Oni-inspired spec for the thief. Those are kind of my updated thoughts on that. I'm sure there are more twists and turns to come in the coming days. So thank you guys for watching this video. I appreciate all the love and support in the past couple days, and I'll see you guys next time.